Israeli rocket shower in Gaza overnight killed 4 more civilians, including a local journalist, bringing the death toll to at least 219 Palestinians and 12 in Israel killed by rocket attacks from Hamas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he is determined to continue military operations in Gaza, despite President Biden calling for a de-escalation. Here with me now to discuss the likelihood of a ceasefire between the two is veteran journalist Connor Powell. He's covered politics and conflicts on the ground in the Middle East for over a decade. He joins us now. Good to see you, Connor.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. President Biden has told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he expects a significant de-escalation. At this point, what do you think that looks like? Is it a ceasefire? And if so, how long do you think that would last?
Yeah, President Biden is still using pretty cautious language to call for that ceasefire. I mean, we heard a couple of days ago that he expected it to wrap up, and now we're saying, he expects the ceasefire to be in place in the next 24, 48 hours. Prime Minister Netanyahu is sort of said and indicated that he's going to continue the military operations until the Israeli security establishment believes they've essentially achieved their goal. So for the most part, it seems like Israel is ignoring the White House's calls for some type of ceasefire. And the White House isn't really putting that much pressure. There are pressure points. There are threats that could be employed in terms of how much or withholding or even suspending military aid to Israel. That type of language we haven't even begun to see from the White House or from other U.S. administration officials. When you start to see that, I think that's the sign that the White House and the administration is frustrated and ready for a ceasefire. Right now, it's a sort of a very tepid call. And that's a signal to Israel to keep doing what they're doing. And Netanyahu has said that they're going to continue these operations until the rocket fire is ended. What we've seen in past conflicts is that never really actually happens. We sort of get to a point where both sides, declare uncle and essentially they say, well, we have a ceasefire. But the stated goal of ending Hamas's rocket fire never actually comes about, which is part of the problem with this ineffective Israeli policy in Gaza, which is they want to see an end to rocket fire. But bombing Palestinians doesn't ever bring that about. If anything, it sort of continues this conflict year in and year out.
So let's talk about the United Nations then. They've held 3 emergency meetings focusing on a resolution, but still no concrete outcome. How does the United States take part in this? Are they blocking a joint statement calling for immediate ceasefire? What are your thoughts on how that piece of the puzzle is factoring?
Yeah, unfortunately, again, this comes down to the Biden administration, like previous administrations. The U.S. has essentially run a blocking maneuver for the Israelis in the Security Council. And so the Security Council can take this up, but when it comes to Israel, the U.S. sort of always protects it. There was one moment at the very end of President Obama's presidency where he allowed, along with some other countries, for some real criticism of Israel. But for the most part, this administration, the Obama's administration and George Bush before him, and even the Trump, obviously, as well, administration, they have always blocked any real criticism or calls for Israel to end the violence. And so at this point, the UN isn't really a player in this. They can help negotiate. They can have some conversations between Israel and Hamas and the United States. And Egypt plays a large role in this because they have a border with both Israel and Gaza. Egypt will play a real role, but neither side is really signaling at this point that they're going to end this conflict. But it should be noted that in the past, when we've reached the sort of 2.5 or the 2-week mark, that's usually when this conflict begins to wind down. So with the language, this sort of tepid language, I think you're probably going to see a ceasefire in the next couple of days, but there's probably still at least 2 or 3 more days of heavy fighting before we get to that ceasefire conversation.
So what is the history there? How did this start then with the relations between the U.S. and Israel?
I mean, the U.S. relationship with Israel goes back decades. With the creation and the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, the U.S. wasn't particularly on board at first with the relationship with Israel. It was actually the Soviet Union and a lot of other Eastern European countries that saw common cause with what at the time was a much more socialist, communist-leaning Israel in the late 40s, early 50s. But the U.S. has long viewed Israel as an ally in the Middle East. in large part because they thought it was sort of a foothold if they ever needed to have a ground invasion in the region, that Israel would be that sort of landing pad. We've seen a whole bunch of wars in the Middle East at this point where that theory has sort of been proven incorrect. The U.S. has never used Israel as a launching pad for wars over oil and things like that. But that was sort of the history of it. But at this point, the U.S. has, American politics particularly, has so become intertwined with Israeli politics that the U.S. has always, in the last 60 years or so, played the role of sort of the provider of weapons, the provider of cover to Israel, while at the same time also trying to at least argue that they're this neutral, unbiased negotiator for peace. You've had some administrations, including President Carter and President Clinton, who have made an effort towards peace. President Bush and Obama have as well. But they've never really gotten to the point where there has been some type of outcome that all sides can sort of say we're happy. And if anything, the Israeli settlement project in the West Bank has really caused the United States a lot of concern here in the last couple of decades, because any hope for a two-state solution rests on there being a viable Palestinian state. And with the growth of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, there really just isn't land at this point for any type of Palestinian state. So the role that the U.S. plays at this point is really just sort of blocking and protecting Israel on the world stage.
Long and complicated history there. Thank you so much, Connor. We appreciate you joining us here on BNC Live to discuss what's happening in the Middle East. Take care. And coming up on BNC Live, a mixed message about masking in Chicago. Who's free to take it off and who has to keep it covered? When BNC comes back from a quick commercial break. Stay with us.